What if a single whispered word could shatter decades of silence and transform two lives forever? On a hilltop in antebellum Georgia, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, an elderly woman approached her young mistress with a secret that had burned in her heart for 40 years. What she was about to ask would challenge everything they believed about power, loyalty, and what it truly means to be free. This is the story of how one impossible request changed the fate of an entire plantation and sparked a chain of events that would echo through the Civil War and beyond. If stories of courage and unexpected human connections move you, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon, because today's tale will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the bonds that tie us together. Magnolia Grove Plantation, Georgia, 1858. The story unfolds in the heart of Georgia's cotton country, 3 years before the Civil War would tear the nation apart. Magnolia Grove Plantation sprawls across 2 idyllic acres of rich red soil, home to the prestigious Whitmore family and over 200 enslaved souls whose labor built an empire of white gold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cotton fields of Magnolia Grove as 73-year-old Mammy Ruth made her way up the familiar path to Sunset Hill. Her weathered hands, scarred by decades of labor and marked by the small burns from countless hours over hot stoves, clutched a worn leather Bible, the only book she had ever held, though she could not read a single word within its pages. At the summit, 26-year-old Miss Catherine Whitmore stood silhouetted against the dying light, her emerald silk dress rustling in the Georgia breeze. She had been mistress of Magnolia Grove for 2 years now, ever since her husband Charles had died in a riding accident, leaving her to manage one of the largest plantations in the county. The hilltop had always been Catherine's refuge, a place where she could escape the suffocating expectations of Southern society and the crushing responsibility of running a plantation she had never wanted to inherit. But tonight, she was not alone. Miss Catherine, Ruth's voice carried across the evening air, rich and deep like molasses, yet trembling with an emotion Catherine had never heard before. Catherine turned, surprised. In all her 26 years, Mammy Ruth had been a constant presence in her life, the woman who had raised her when her own mother died in childbirth, who had tended her through childhood illnesses, who had braided her hair for her wedding day. Yet Ruth had never approached her like this, as an equal seeking an audience rather than a servant awaiting orders. "Mammy Ruth, what brings you up here? You should be supervising dinner preparations." The old woman's eyes held something Catherine had never seen before, not the familiar warmth and devotion, not the careful deference that had defined their relationship, but a quiet determination that seemed to burn from within like banked coals suddenly given air. "I got something to ask you, Miss Catherine. Something I should have asked long ago, but never had the courage." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of magnolia blossoms and the distant sound of evening songs from the slave quarters below. Catherine noticed how Ruth's hands trembled, not from age, though she was well past 70, but from the magnitude of what she was about to say. "Of course, Mammy Ruth, you know you can ask me anything." For a moment, the elderly woman seemed to gather strength from the very earth beneath her feet. She had worked this land since she was 13 years old, brought here in chains from a plantation in Virginia. She had seen 3 generations of Whitmores grow up in the big house, had kept their secrets, tended their wounds, and loved them despite the circumstances that bound her to them. "I want to learn to read. Miss Catherine, I want you to teach me." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. In 1858, Georgia, teaching a slave to read was not just unusual, it was illegal, punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. The state had passed strict laws forbidding slave literacy after Nat Turner's rebellion, fearing that education would lead to insurrection. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Of all the requests she might have anticipated, this was perhaps the most dangerous. "Mammy Ruth, why now? After all these years?" The old woman's eyes filled with tears she had held back for 4 decades. "Because I got a great-granddaughter now, Miss Catherine, little Susanna, down in the quarters. She's 8 years old, and she's smart as a whip. She asks me questions I can't answer, wants to know about the words in your books, about why some folks can read the good book, while others just got to trust what they're told it says." Ruth's voice grew stronger with each word, 40 years of suppressed longing pouring out like water through a broken dam. "I want to read the Bible for myself, Miss Catherine. I want to know what the Lord really says about folks like me. And I want to teach little Susanna so she don't have to go through life blind to the written word like I have." The confession hung between them as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in deeper shades of orange and purple. Catherine found herself seeing Ruth not as the devoted mammy who had always been part of the background of her life, but as a woman with dreams, fears, and a love so powerful it had given her the courage to risk everything. "You know what you're asking of me," Catherine said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the authorities discovered this, if the other plantation owners found out." "I know the risks, Miss Catherine. Lord knows I do. But I also know that you ain't like the others. You got your daddy's kind heart, but you got something he never had. You question things. I seen you reading those newspapers from up north, seen the way you look when you hear talk about the abolitionists." When the simple observation carried years of careful watching, of seeing Catherine grow from a curious child who questioned why some people lived in the big house while others lived in the quarters, to a young woman who had always treated the enslaved workers with more kindness than was expected or approved of by her peers. Ruth continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've been watching you struggle with this place, Miss Catherine. I know you didn't want this life, didn't want to be responsible for all these souls. But maybe we can find a way to make it better. Maybe teaching me to read is the first step." As darkness began to settle over the hilltop, both women stood at the edge of a decision that would change everything. The old order was crumbling across the South, though few were willing to admit it. War was coming. Everyone could feel it in the air like the electricity before a thunderstorm. And perhaps, in this moment, they could help shape what would rise from the ashes. Catherine looked out over the plantation that stretched as far as the eye could see, at the neat rows of slave cabins where families were gathering for their evening meal, at the fields where tomorrow hundreds of people would labor under the scorching sun to make her wealthy. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the weight of what she owned, not land and cotton, but human souls. "If we do this," Catherine said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "we'll have to be extremely careful. No one can know, not the overseer, not the other house servants, not even your own family, until we're certain it's safe." Ruth's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the gathering darkness. "You mean you'll do it? You'll teach me?" "Yes," Catherine said, the word carrying with it the weight of revolution. "But we start slowly, and we start tonight. Meet me in the library after midnight. Everyone will be asleep, and we'll have privacy." As they made their way down the hill together, neither woman spoke of the magnitude of what they had just agreed to, but both understood that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The relationship between mistress and slave, between white and black, between the powerful and the powerless, had shifted in ways that would ripple far beyond the borders of Magnolia Grove. That night, as the plantation settled into sleep, Catherine sat in her late husband's library, surrounded by hundreds of books that represented knowledge, power, and privilege. She had selected a simple primer, the same book she had learned from as a child, and placed it on the mahogany desk alongside a slate and chalk. When Ruth appeared at the library door, moving silently through the shadows, like she had learned to do over decades of servitude, Catherine felt her heart racing. They were about to embark on something that could destroy them both, but also something that could set them free in ways neither had ever imagined. "Are you ready, Mammy Ruth?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been ready for 70 years, Miss Catherine. I've been ready my whole life." The grandfather clock in the corner of the library chimed midnight as Catherine opened the primer to its first page. The room was lit only by a single oil lamp, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Ruth sat across from Catherine at the massive mahogany desk, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap. She had never sat at this desk before, had never sat in the presence of a white person without permission. The transgression felt almost as significant as the reading lesson itself. "We'll start with the alphabet," Catherine said softly, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the clock. "Each letter has a name and a sound. A, B, C." She wrote the letters carefully on the slate, and Ruth watched with the intensity of someone witnessing a miracle. When Catherine handed her the chalk, the old woman's fingers trembled as she traced the letters, her movements careful and deliberate. "This here's an A," Ruth whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "It looks like a little house with a line across the middle." "That's right. And this is B. See how it has 2 bumps on the side." For the next hour, they worked through the alphabet, Ruth's quick mind absorbing each lesson with a hunger that amazed Catherine. The old woman had been denied education for 7 decades, but her intelligence was sharp and eager. "Now," Catherine said, turning to a new page, "let's try to spell your name. R-U-T-H. She wrote each letter carefully, and Ruth copied them with growing confidence. When she finished, she stared at the slate with tears in her eyes. "That's my name," she whispered. "That's me, right there, on this slate." "Yes, it is. And this," Catherine wrote below it, "is Susanna." At the sight of her great-granddaughter's name, Ruth's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she traced the letters again and again, memorizing each curve and line. Their lessons continued in secret over the following weeks. They met every night at midnight, when the plantation was deep in sleep and the risk of discovery was lowest. Ruth proved to be a remarkably quick learner, her mind sharp despite her lack of formal education. She absorbed each lesson with a desperation that spoke to decades of intellectual starvation. But their clandestine meetings did not go unnoticed. Jeremiah Hawkins, the plantation overseer, was a man who prided himself on knowing everything that happened on Magnolia Grove. He had been hired by Catherine's late husband specifically because of his reputation for maintaining strict discipline and preventing any hint of rebellion among the slaves. Hawkins had noticed Ruth's frequent absences from her regular duties, her distracted demeanor during the day, and the way she sometimes moved her lips silently as if practicing something. He was a man who believed that any deviation from routine was potentially dangerous, and he had begun watching Ruth with growing suspicion. One morning, as Ruth struggled with a particularly difficult passage about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, a story that resonated deeply with her own dreams of freedom, Catherine noticed her student's hands shaking more than usual. "What troubles you, Mammy Ruth?" "It's Mr. Hawkins, Miss Catherine. He been asking questions about where I go at night, why I've been so tired during the day. I told him I've been having trouble sleeping, been walking the grounds to clear my head, but I don't think he believes me." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. Hawkins had been her husband's choice, not hers, and while she was technically his superior, She knew he had little respect for her authority as a woman. He had made it clear on numerous occasions that he thought the plantation would be better managed by a man. "Perhaps we should stop for a while," Catherine suggested reluctantly, "until the suspicion dies down." "No, Miss Catherine." Ruth's voice was firm, stronger than Catherine had ever heard it. "I won't let fear steal this from me, from Susanna. We done come too far to turn back now." That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, Hawkins appeared at the library door during their usual evening lesson. He had been watching the house, had seen the faint light under the door, and had decided to investigate. The slate fell from Ruth's hands, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. "Well, well." Hawkins' voice was cold and calculating, his eyes taking in the scene before him. The primer open on the desk, the broken slate with letters still visible on its fragments, Ruth's terrified face. "What do we have here?" Catherine stood quickly, placing herself between Hawkins and Ruth. "This is a private matter, Mr. Hawkins. You may go." "Oh, but this isn't private at all, Mrs. Whitmore. This is a crime. Teaching slaves to read is against the law in Georgia, punishable by fine and imprisonment. Your late husband would be rolling in his grave if he knew what you were doing." "My husband is dead," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "And I am the owner of this plantation now." Hawkins' laugh was harsh and bitter. "You're a foolish woman playing with fire, Mrs. Whitmore. Do you have any idea what happens when slaves learn to read? They get ideas above their station. They start thinking they're equal to white folks. They start planning rebellions." He gestured toward Ruth, who sat frozen in her chair. "This old woman has been filling her head with dangerous notions, and now she'll spread them to the others. Mark my words, within a month we'll have an uprising on our hands." "That's ridiculous," Catherine protested. "Mammy Ruth has been with this family for 60 years. She's not planning any rebellion." "Isn't she?" Hawkins pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, one of Ruth's practice sheets that she had carelessly left in her cabin. "I found this hidden under her mattress. She's been practicing writing, Mrs. Whitmore, writing letters. Who do you think she's planning to write to? What messages do you think she wants to send?" The implication hung heavy in the air. In the current climate of fear and suspicion that gripped the South, any form of communication among slaves was viewed as potentially seditious. The Underground Railroad was active in Georgia, and plantation owners lived in constant fear that their slaves might be in contact with abolitionists. "I demand that you stop these lessons immediately," Hawkins continued, his voice rising, "and I demand that this slave be punished as an example to the others. 20 lashes should suffice to remind her of her place." "No." The word came out of Catherine's mouth before she could stop it, firm and final. "I will not allow you to harm her." Hawkins stared at her in disbelief. "You're protecting a slave over the safety of your own plantation, over your own reputation. Mrs. Whitmore, if word of this gets out, you'll be ruined. No decent family in Georgia will associate with you. The authorities will investigate every aspect of your operation here." As he turned to leave, his intentions clear, Ruth spoke for the first time since he had discovered them. "Please, Mr. Hawkins, don't report this. I'll stop the lessons. I'll burn the book. I'll do anything you ask." Hawkins paused at the door, a cruel smile playing at his lips. "It's too late for that, old woman. Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. And you, Mrs. Whitmore, have crossed the most dangerous line of all." Word of the reading lessons spread through the county like wildfire. Within 3 days, a delegation of the most prominent plantation owners in the region had arrived at Magnolia Grove, their faces grim with disapproval and their intentions clear. Colonel James Beauregard, the most influential landowner in the county and a man who had served in the state legislature, led the group. He was a man who had built his fortune on the backs of enslaved workers and saw any challenge to the system as a personal threat to his way of life. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal authority as they gathered in the plantation's main parlor, "this madness must stop immediately. You're endangering all of us with these foolish ideas." The parlor was the same room where Catherine's husband had entertained these same men, discussing cotton prices, slave management, and the growing tensions with the North. But now, instead of talking business, they were debating the fundamental nature of human dignity and the social order that governed their world. "I fail to see how teaching someone to read endangers anyone," Catherine replied, her voice calm but her hands clenched in her lap. "It gives them ideas above their station," interjected Thaddeus Morrison, another plantation owner whose family had owned slaves for 3 generations. "Next, they'll be demanding wages, freedom, equal treatment. Where does it end, Catherine? Where does it end?" "Perhaps," Catherine said quietly, "it ends with us treating them as human beings." The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Beauregard leaned forward, his eyes hard as granite. "Your husband was a practical man, Catherine. He understood the natural order of things, understood that God himself ordained the relationship between master and slave. This experiment of yours threatens everything we've built here in Georgia." "The natural order?" Catherine stood, her composure finally cracking. "Is it natural for a grandmother to be forbidden from reading Bible stories to her great-granddaughter? Is it natural for intelligent, capable people to be treated as property? Is it natural for human beings to be bought and sold like cattle?" "It is the way things have always been," Colonel Beauregard replied firmly. "It is the foundation of our society, our economy, our very way of life. And it is the way they must remain. The authorities have been informed of your activities, Catherine. Unless you cease immediately and punish the slave appropriately, there will be serious consequences." Judge William Hartwell, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Catherine, I've known your family for 30 years. Your father was a respected man, your husband was my friend, but what you're doing here, it's not just illegal, it's dangerous. There are rumors of war coming, rumors that the North means to destroy our way of life. We cannot afford to have dissension in our own ranks." "And what of Mammy Ruth?" Catherine asked. "What punishment do you propose for a 73-year-old woman whose only crime was wanting to read the Bible?" 25 lashes, Colonel Beauregard said without hesitation. "Public, so that all the slaves on the plantation understand the consequences of such behavior, and she should be sold immediately, sent to the rice plantations in South Carolina, where she can do no more harm." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. Ruth had been with her family for 60 years, had raised Catherine from infancy, had been more of a mother to her than her own mother ever could have been. The thought of her being whipped and sold was unbearable. "I won't allow it," Catherine said firmly. "Then you leave us no choice," Judge Hartwell said sadly. "We'll have to involve the authorities. The sheriff will come, Catherine. There will be an investigation. Your slaves will be questioned, your property searched. And when they find evidence of your illegal activities, and they will find evidence, you'll face criminal charges." That evening, as the delegation departed with their ultimatum, Catherine found herself once again on Sunset Hill, where this journey had begun. But this time she was not alone. Ruth approached slowly, her face etched with worry and guilt. "Miss Catherine, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to bring trouble to you." "The trouble was already here, Mammy Ruth. I just chose to see it for the first time." They stood in silence as the sun set once again over the Georgia countryside. In the distance they could hear the evening songs rising from the slave quarters, voices lifted in harmony despite their circumstances, spirituals that spoke of freedom, of crossing over Jordan, of a promised land where all God's children would be free. "What will you do, Miss Catherine?" Ruth asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could comply with the demands, punish Ruth publicly, and return to the old ways. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice. Her reputation would be damaged but not destroyed. Her property would remain intact. Her position in society would be preserved. But as she looked at the woman beside her, a woman who had risked everything for the simple dream of reading the Bible to her great-granddaughter, she realized that some choices define who we truly are. Some moments demand that we choose between safety and conscience, between conformity and courage. "I'm going to continue teaching you," Catherine said finally, "but not here. It's too dangerous now." Ruth's eyes widened. "Miss Catherine, you can't. They'll destroy you. They'll take everything you have." "Perhaps. But if I stop now, if I let fear win, then I'll have destroyed myself anyway. I'll have become someone I can't live with." That night, Catherine made a decision that would change not just her own life, but the lives of everyone on Magnolia Grove. She began making quiet inquiries about the Underground Railroad, about safe houses and sympathetic families who might help escaped slaves find freedom in the North. But she also began planning something even more radical, something that would challenge the very foundations of the society she had been born into. 2 weeks after the confrontation with the plantation owners, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Hayes, a physician from Atlanta, arrived at Magnolia Grove under the pretense of checking on the health of the slaves, a service he provided to several plantations in the region. But Dr. Hayes was more than just a physician. He was a secret member of the Underground Railroad, a man who used his medical practice as cover for helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Catherine had reached out to him through a carefully worded letter, using coded language that indicated her willingness to help. They met in the plantation's medical cabin, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Dr. Hayes was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair, worn down by the weight of the secrets he carried. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I understand you're interested in alternative approaches to plantation management." "I am," Catherine replied carefully. "I believe there are better ways to treat the people in my care." Dr. Hayes nodded, understanding the coded language. "There are others who share your beliefs, Mrs. Whitmore, a network of people who believe that all human beings deserve freedom and dignity. But the work is dangerous, and once you're involved, there's no turning back." Over the next hour, Dr. Hayes explained how the Underground Railroad operated in Georgia. There were safe houses hidden throughout the state, operated by free blacks, sympathetic whites, and even some Native American tribes. Escaped slaves were moved from station to station under cover of darkness, following routes that led north to freedom. "What would you need from me?" Catherine asked. "Magnolia Grove is perfectly positioned," Dr. Hayes explained. "You're close enough to the main roads for easy access, but isolated enough that unusual activity might go unnoticed. We could use your plantation as a way station, a place where escaping slaves could rest and resupply before continuing their journey north." Catherine felt her heart racing. What Dr. Hayes was proposing was far more dangerous than teaching Ruth to read. Harboring fugitive slaves was a federal crime under the Fugitive Slave Act, punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. If she were caught, she would lose everything. "There's something else," Catherine said. "I want to help some of my own people escape, starting with Mammy Ruth and her family." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual. Most plantation owners who help us are motivated by abstract principles. They don't typically help their own slaves escape. "Ruth isn't just my slave," Catherine said firmly. "She's the woman who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who showed me what love looks like. I can't stand by and watch her be punished for wanting to read the Bible." That night, Catherine met with Ruth in the library once more. But instead of a reading lesson, she had a different kind of education to offer. "Mammy Ruth," she said carefully, "how would you feel about taking a trip north? To a place where you could read any book you wanted, where Susanna could go to school, where your family could be truly free?" Ruth's eyes widened in disbelief. "You talking about running away, Miss Catherine? You talking about the Underground Railroad?" "I'm talking about freedom, Mammy Ruth, real freedom, not just for you, but for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A chance to live as human beings instead of property." For a long moment, Ruth was silent, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Catherine was offering. Freedom had been a dream so distant, so impossible, that she had barely allowed herself to imagine it. "What about you, Miss Catherine? What happens to you if we run?" "I'll be fine," Catherine lied. "I'll say you escaped on your own, that I had no knowledge of your plans. The important thing is getting you and your family to safety." But Ruth was too wise to believe the lie. "They'll know, Miss Catherine. Mr. Hawkins will make sure they know. You'll lose everything. The plantation, your reputation, maybe even your freedom. Then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Over the next month, Catherine and Dr. Hayes worked together to plan the escape. Ruth's family included her son Moses, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Susanna, along with 2 other grandchildren. 7 people in total would need to be moved north to safety. The plan was complex and dangerous. The family would leave Magnolia Grove on a moonless night, traveling to a safe house operated by a free black family in Macon. From there, they would be moved north through a series of stations, eventually reaching Pennsylvania, where they would be truly free. But as the date of the escape approached, Catherine realized that she couldn't bear the thought of staying behind. The plantation that had been her prison for so long held nothing for her now. Her husband was dead, she had no children, and the society that had shaped her entire life was about to be torn apart by war. "I'm coming with you," she told Ruth the night before the planned escape. "Miss Catherine, you can't. You're white. You got a life here, a future. You don't need to run." "Yes, I do," Catherine said firmly. "I need to run from a life that was built on the suffering of others. I need to run towards something better, something I can be proud of." The night of the escape was moonless and cloudy, perfect for their purposes. Catherine had dismissed the night watchman, claiming she wanted to walk the grounds alone to clear her head, a habit she had established over the past month to avoid suspicion. At midnight, Ruth and her family gathered at the edge of the cotton fields, carrying only small bundles of essential belongings. Catherine met them there, dressed in simple traveling clothes and carrying a bag of gold coins. Her entire inheritance converted to portable wealth. Dr. Hayes waited with a covered wagon, its bottom fitted with a false floor where the escaping slaves could hide if they encountered patrols. Catherine would ride openly beside him, posing as his wife traveling to visit relatives in Macon. "Are you sure about this, Miss Catherine?" Ruth asked one last time as they prepared to leave. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Catherine replied. "The journey to Macon took 2 days, traveling by back roads and avoiding the main highways where they might encounter slave catchers or suspicious authorities. They spent the first night hidden in a barn, owned by a sympathetic farmer, huddled together in the darkness while Catherine kept watch. During those long hours, Catherine and Ruth talked more openly than they ever had before. Ruth shared stories of her childhood in Virginia, of being torn from her own mother at the age of 13 and sold to Catherine's grandfather. Catherine spoke of her loneliness growing up in the big house, of feeling trapped by expectations she never chose. "I always wondered," Ruth said quietly, "why you never seemed happy, even when you had everything a white woman could want." "Because I knew it was built on a lie," Catherine replied. "I knew that my comfort came from your suffering, and I could never reconcile that with what I believed was right." On the second night, they reached the safe house in Macon, a modest home owned by Samuel and Rebecca Johnson, a free black couple who had been helping escaped slaves for over a decade. The Johnsons welcomed them warmly, providing hot food and safe beds for the first time since they had left Magnolia Grove. "You're brave people," Samuel Johnson told them as they prepared to continue their journey north. "But the hardest part is still ahead. Georgia is one thing, but once you cross into Tennessee and Kentucky, the slave catchers get more aggressive. They know that's the main route north." The next leg of their journey took them through the mountains of North Georgia and into Tennessee. They traveled mostly at night now, hiding during the day in caves, abandoned cabins, and the homes of Underground Railroad conductors. It was during this part of the journey that they encountered their first real danger. A group of slave catchers, led by a notorious bounty hunter named Jake Morrison, had been tracking them since they left Macon. Morrison was known for his brutality and his determination to capture escaped slaves, dead or alive. They were hiding in a cave in the Tennessee mountains when they heard the dogs barking in the distance. Morrison's bloodhounds had picked up their scent, and the hunters were closing in. "We have to split up," Dr. Hayes said urgently. "It's our only chance. Catherine, you come with me. We'll lead them away from the others." "No," Catherine said firmly. "We stay together. We started this journey together, and we'll finish it together." But Ruth had other ideas. "Miss Catherine, you and the doctor go on ahead. Take Susanna with you. The rest of us will find another way. I'm not leaving you, Mammy Ruth. I'm not leaving any of you." In the end, they decided to make a desperate run for it together. They left the cave under cover of darkness, moving as quickly and quietly as they could through the dense forest. Behind them, they could hear the dogs getting closer, their barking echoing through the mountains. They ran for hours, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Little Susanna, only 8 years old, kept pace with remarkable determination, her small hand clutched tightly in Catherine's. Just as dawn was breaking, they reached a river that marked the border between Tennessee and Kentucky. On the other side waited another Underground Railroad conductor, a white minister named Reverend Thomas, who operated a station in a small Kentucky town. But the river was swollen from recent rains, running fast and deep. There was no bridge, no ferry, no easy way across. And behind them, the sound of the dogs was getting louder. "I can't swim," Ruth said, her voice filled with despair. "None of us can swim." Dr. Hayes looked around desperately, searching for some way to get them across. That's when Catherine made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "I'll go first," she said, wading into the cold water. "I'm a strong swimmer. I'll get a rope across, and we can use it to help the others." The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and the water was shockingly cold. Halfway across, she felt herself being swept downstream, fighting desperately to reach the other side. Just when she thought she might drown, strong hands pulled her from the water. Reverend Thomas and 2 other men had been waiting on the Kentucky side, and they quickly organized a rescue. Using ropes and a small boat, they managed to get everyone across, just as Morrison and his men appeared on the Tennessee side. The slave catchers could only watch in frustration as their quarry escaped across the state line. Morrison fired several shots across the water, but they fell harmlessly short. The journey from Kentucky to Pennsylvania took another 2 weeks, moving through a network of safe houses operated by Quakers, free blacks, and other abolitionists. Each night brought new dangers, new challenges, but also new hope as they moved steadily toward freedom. Catherine found herself changing during the journey, shedding the refined mannerisms and expectations of Southern society, like a snake shedding its skin. She learned to sleep on the ground, to eat whatever food was available, to move silently through the darkness. Most importantly, she learned what it meant to depend on others and to have others depend on her. Ruth, meanwhile, seemed to grow younger with each mile they traveled north. The weight of servitude that had bowed her shoulders for 70 years was lifting, replaced by a dignity and confidence that Catherine had never seen before. "I can't believe it's real," Ruth said one night as they camped in a barn in southern Ohio. "I can't believe we're really going to be free." "It's real, Mammy Ruth. In a few more days, you'll be able to read any book you want. Go anywhere you please, say anything you think. You'll be truly free." But freedom, they discovered, came with its own challenges. When they finally reached Philadelphia, they found a city teeming with escaped slaves, free blacks, and white abolitionists, but also with poverty, discrimination, and uncertainty. The Underground Railroad had arrangements with several Quaker families who helped newly arrived refugees find housing and employment. Catherine and Ruth's family were taken in by the Whitman family, prosperous merchants who had been helping escaped slaves for over 20 years. "Welcome to freedom," said Elizabeth Whitman, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who embraced them all warmly. "You're safe now, but the real work is just beginning." She was right. Freedom meant learning to navigate a new world, finding work, establishing new identities. Ruth, despite her age, threw herself into learning with renewed vigor. She spent hours each day with Catherine, working through reading primers and practicing her letters. Catherine, meanwhile, faced her own challenges. She had given up everything, her wealth, her social position, her entire identity, to help Ruth's family escape. Now, she had to build a new life from nothing, in a city where she knew no one and had no connections. She found work as a seamstress, using skills she had learned as a young woman, but had never needed to employ for survival. The work was hard, and the pay was small. But it was honest labor, and for the first time in her life, Catherine felt truly proud of what she was doing. Ruth found work as a cook for a wealthy Quaker family, her skills in the kitchen making her valuable despite her age. But her real passion was learning to read and teaching others to do the same. Within 6 months of their arrival in Philadelphia, Ruth had established a small school in the basement of a black church, teaching reading and writing to escaped slaves and free blacks who had never had the opportunity to learn. Catherine helped her, and together they created something beautiful, a place where knowledge was shared freely, where human dignity was respected, where the color of one's skin didn't determine one's worth. Little Susanna, now 9 years old, enrolled in a real school for the first time in her life. She proved to be as intelligent as Ruth had always claimed, quickly mastering reading, writing, and arithmetic. Her dream was to become a teacher herself someday, to help other children learn to read. In April 1861, 3 years after their escape from Georgia, the news reached Philadelphia that Confederate forces had fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun, and the country Catherine and Ruth had fled was tearing itself apart. "Do you think we'll ever be able to go back?" Ruth asked as they read the newspaper accounts of the fighting. "I don't know," Catherine replied honestly. "But maybe, when this is all over, there will be a different South to go back to, a better South." As the war progressed, Philadelphia became a center of activity for the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass spoke at rallies. Harriet Tubman passed through on her missions to rescue more slaves, and the Underground Railroad worked overtime to help people escape the chaos of the war-torn South. Catherine and Ruth threw themselves into the war effort, helping to organize supplies for escaped slaves, raising money for the Union cause, and continuing their educational work. Ruth's school had grown to serve over 50 students, and Catherine had become a respected member of the abolitionist community. In 1863, when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, they celebrated with thousands of other free blacks and abolitionists in the streets of Philadelphia. Ruth, now 78 years old but still sharp and energetic, stood on the steps of Independence Hall and read the proclamation aloud to the crowd, the same woman who had been forbidden to read just 5 years earlier. "Free at last," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." But even as they celebrated, both women knew that the legal end of slavery was just the beginning. The real work of building a just society was still ahead. The war ended in April 1865, but the peace that followed was fragile and uncertain. Reports from the South told of chaos and confusion, of former slaves struggling to build new lives, of white Southerners resisting change, of federal troops trying to maintain order. In 1867, Catherine received a letter that changed everything. It was from Dr. Samuel Hayes, who had survived the war and was now working with the Freedmen's Bureau in Georgia. He wrote that Magnolia Grove had been abandoned during the war, its fields lying fallow, its buildings falling into disrepair. "The federal government is looking for qualified people to help with reconstruction efforts," he wrote. "They need teachers, administrators, people who understand both the Old South and the new possibilities. Would you consider coming back?" Catherine showed the letter to Ruth, who was now 82 years old, but still teaching at her school every day. "What do you think, Mammy Ruth? Should we go back?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I swore I'd never set foot in Georgia again," she said finally. "But maybe it's time to finish what we started." The decision to return was not easy. They had built good lives in Philadelphia, had found purpose and meaning in their work, but the call to help rebuild the South, to help create the just society they had dreamed of, was too strong to ignore. In the spring of 1868, Catherine and Ruth, along with Susanna, now a young woman of 17, and several other teachers and volunteers, traveled south to Georgia. The journey that had once been a desperate flight to freedom was now a purposeful return to help heal a wounded land. Magnolia Grove was indeed in ruins. The great house stood empty, its windows broken and its roof leaking. The slave quarters had been abandoned, and the fields were overgrown with weeds. But the land was still there, still fertile, still full of potential. Catherine used her remaining savings to purchase the plantation from the federal government, but this time with a very different vision. Instead of a plantation worked by enslaved labor, she envisioned a community of free farmers, a place where former slaves could own their own land and build their own futures. Ruth established a new school in the old plantation house, teaching reading and writing to children and adults who had been denied education for generations. Susanna became her assistant teacher, fulfilling the dream that had begun with a simple request to learn to read. The work was hard and often dangerous. Many white Southerners resented the changes that Reconstruction had brought, and there were frequent threats and acts of violence against those who worked to help former slaves. But Catherine and Ruth persevered, driven by the same courage that had carried them through their escape years earlier. By 1875, the community at Magnolia Grove had grown to include over 100 families. Former slaves had become landowners, their children were attending school, and a new way of life was taking root in the Georgia soil. Ruth, now 90 years old, had become something of a legend in the region. People traveled from miles around to hear the story of the slave woman who had learned to read and then taught hundreds of others to do the same. She had written her autobiography with Catherine's help, and it had been published by a northern publishing house, becoming one of the first slave narratives written by a woman. Catherine, now 53, had never married again or had children of her own. but she considered herself the mother of the community they had built, and the grandmother of all the children who had learned to read in Ruth's school. On a warm evening in May 1875, the two women found themselves once again on Sunset Hill, the place where their journey had begun 17 years earlier. But now, instead of looking out over fields worked by enslaved labor, they saw small farms owned by free families, children playing in yards, smoke rising from chimneys of homes where people lived as they chose. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked. "Giving up the life you had, taking such risks?" Ruth smiled, her weathered face creased with lines of laughter and wisdom. "Miss Catherine, I spent 73 years of my life not knowing who I was because I couldn't read my own name. These last 17 years, I've been more alive than all those years put together." She paused, looking out over the community they had built. "Besides, look what came from that one simple request. Look at all these children learning to read, all these families building their own futures. Sometimes one small act of courage can change the whole world." As the sun set over Magnolia Grove, for what would be one of the last times they would watch it together, Ruth would pass away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months later. Both women reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A single wish, whispered at dusk on a Georgia hilltop, had indeed changed the course of their lives. But more than that, it had changed the course of history itself. One lesson, one letter, one act of courage at a time. Susanna, now a teacher herself and the mother of 3 children, joined them on the hill as the stars began to appear. "Tell me again, Grandmama Ruth," she said, settling beside the old woman. "Tell me about the night you asked Miss Catherine to teach you to read." And Ruth, her voice still strong despite her age, began the story once more. The story of how a slave woman's dream of literacy had become a community's reality of freedom. How a mistress's act of courage had helped heal a nation's wounds. And how the simple desire to read the Bible to a great-granddaughter had changed the world. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with armies or declarations, but with a simple request whispered between 2 people who dare to see each other as human beings. Ruth's wish to learn to read became a catalyst for change that rippled far beyond the borders of one plantation, proving that education is indeed the most powerful weapon for changing the world. In the ashes of the Old South, they built something new, a community founded not on the exploitation of human beings, but on the recognition of human dignity and the transformative power of knowledge. If this story of courage and transformation moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. History is full of unsung heroes whose small acts of bravery changed everything, and their stories deserve to be told. What act of courage will you choose today? Remember, sometimes the most important revolutions begin with a single person brave enough to ask for something they've been told they can never have.